Welcome to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. This is episode 4, part 3, the fall of Fort Niagara and the closing of the West. What did the administration of New France envision for the 1759 campaign? Well, they knew a three-pronged British attempt was going to occur, but Montcalm and Governor-General Vaudreuil disagreed on where to make a stand. Vaudreuil truly believed that the Ohio River country could be regained, and Fort Niagara was the key to these plans. He believed a strong garrison could hold out for weeks. If no British attack materialized, the force could be sent down the Ohio to attack Fort Pitt. Montcalm saw more value in reducing the frontier defense size in New France and pulling all available forces back to the St. Lawrence heartland. They could defend the rapids above Montreal against any Ontario-born invasion fleet, use the forts on the Richelieu River to blunt a thrust up the Champlain Valley, and rely on the fortress at Quebec to hold any British advance from the Atlantic. Both men agreed to garrison it, with Vaudreuil envisioning the post as a springboard for offensive operations and Montcalm viewing the fort as merely a delaying operation to focus on the St. Lawrence. The French commander chosen for this assignment had been recently dismissed from his previous tenure at Niagara, but other French officers coveted the fur trading opportunities that came along with the command. Captain Pouchot was an experienced officer familiar with the diplomatic nuances of the Pays d'Ont and the original commander to improve the fortifications several years earlier. He was given 2 brigs with 10 12-pounder guns at La Présentation and sailed with the militia bateau for Niagara in April. In his last meeting with Montcalm, Pouchot ominously stated, "It appears we shall see each other next in England." When he arrived at Fort Niagara, the fort's former commander had left the site in disrepair and damaged relations with the local Seneca of the Iroquois Confederacy. The French had much work to do and little time to complete it. Still, Niagara was a formidable stronghold. Triangular Fort Niagara sits at the mouth of the Niagara River and controls the routes to Detroit and down onto the Ohio River. It was not a civilian center, but a guarded military supply depot to facilitate the trade and diplomatic presence required to maintain the stretched-out set of French communication nodules down through the Mississippi Valley. 2 sides of the fort were defended by water, but the landward side was considerably fortified. Across the breadth of the landward-facing side, the French dug a massive trench and used the dirt to build a sod-covered rampart on the face of the fort. The rest of the dirt was turned into a slope-lined glacis on the other side of the ditch. A covered entrance through the rampart was constructed, and a stone curtain wall was raised with bastions flanking the points on both ends. The revamping of the fortifications from a wooden stockade at the start of the war to this now stone fortress would deeply muddle British plans when they finally arrived before Niagara's walls. The fort's main purpose was to defend the portage around the falls. With an 180-foot elevation change and several miles of hard-to-traverse terrain, the portage was a difficult spot to seize. Dense woods also occupied the peninsula just several hundred yards from the fort's outer works. Through this snaked the small portage road. William Shirley made the original attempt against these fortifications in 1755, but got stalled late in the campaigning season due to bad storms in Lake Ontario. As soon as Geoffrey Amherst reached Albany in early 1759, he received letters from Sir William Johnson that besieged him to make the final strike west and cut off the Pays d'Ont. The attack on Fort Niagara was to be part of a simultaneous final British thrust that saw Wolfe approaching Quebec from the east on the St. Lawrence, and Amherst marching up the Champlain corridor. Troops were moved into position in Albany by that spring, and the hope was that once Niagara had been seized and Oswego rebuilt, the British would press up the back door to the St. Lawrence and destroy the shipbuilding yards at La Galette. Johnson had not only provided a sound tactical and operational plan to aid the British imperial strategy, but Niagara's fall would also eliminate the headquarters of his biggest French trading rivals. Johnson began 1759 by barnstorming the Iroquois Confederacy, and by April 6th, the nations agreed to support his strike with some 600 warriors. French militarization of the portage, poor harvests, and British success at Frontenac and Louisbourg had wreaked tremendous change in the geopolitical power of the French vis-a-vis the Iroquois. Surrounding all of this was the desire of the Iroquois to seize control of the Ohio for themselves, and the high possibility the British could just destroy the fort and leave. This would open an important trading choke point and leave it under control of the Seneca, and by extension the League. Johnson was given almost 5,000 pounds for gifts and arms for his native allies. He sensed the tide of war was changing, and knew his request would be met with a largely positive response from the Iroquois in terms of the warriors provided. Only in May of 1759 did Johnson receive the official permission to begin his campaign west. British forces moved up the Mohawk to the newly constructed Fort Stanwix near the eastern shore of Lake Oneida. The official commander of the expedition was a colonel by the name of John Prideaux. With William Johnson in charge of mustering native forces for support, they marched to Oswego and arrived in June. There, the British forces were split in half, with some reconstructing the base at Oswego and more than 2,500 setting out west towards Niagara on June 30th. Making 10 miles a day along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, they landed at Mile Creek on July 6th and there encountered an advanced French guard. Native British forces screened and scouted the area over several days at the lower landing of the Niagara. The small French outpost guarding this was destroyed, and the detachment retreated to the fort itself. On July 10th, the siege of the main fort began with trenches being dug 640 yards out. According to historian Brian Leigh Dunnigan, men worked in parties of 6. The chief of the sap moved forward to rough out the work. Following lines laid down by the engineer, he placed gabions, or empty wicker containers, along the projected trench on the side facing the fortress. His only cover from hostile fire, aside from the darkness, was a gabion stuffed with fascines, which were bundles of tightly bound sticks. This was turned on its side and rolled ahead of him. The chief of the sap would next dig a little trench 18 inches wide and 2 feet deep along the marker line and behind the gabions. The evacuated dirt was used to fill more gabions to form the beginnings of a sturdy earthen wall protecting the trench from the fort's cannons. This back-breaking work was performed kneeling or bent over. Each successive man would follow and widen the trench by a foot, and the last man would add the depth, the entire time filling additional gabions to create a protected position. On the first night of the siege, Mohawks prowled the no man's land and ambushed French scouting parties. The next day, the French attempted a sortie but were pushed back as the British began to lob mortars into the fort. The proper set of siege trenches provided the cover for the artillery to work at close range, but the British were slow to bring up the heavy batteries to blast down the walls of the French fort. Seneca forces agreed to withdraw from the battle on the night of July 11th and retired a mile away to a place called La Belle Famille, and were absent from their siege until the French relief forces arrived 12 days later. French diplomatic overtures still had their effects. Finally, on July 17th, British breech batteries had reached within 200 yards of the fort and opened fire. The French were also surprised to take fire in the fort's rear from a battery constructed across the Niagara River. On July 19th, the sole operating French frigate on Lake Ontario delivered messages to the fort and relayed the situation to the commanders in Montreal of the fort's predicament. By the time the ship sailed back to the ruins of Frontenac and picked up 200 reinforcements, the fort would be in British hands. Sir William Johnson was elevated to overall command when Colonel Prideaux was accidentally killed by a mortar he wandered too close to on the night of July 20th. Ammunition was running low several days later for the British, and disease was mounting. In the meantime, Commander Pouchot still had hope and a secret weapon. He sent out word to French forces at Fort Marschultz in the Ohio River Valley. The post still contained 800 troops and 400 native allies sent there by Pouchot earlier when he thought his position was safe from British attack. He hoped these forces could begin to retake the Ohio River Valley, but that dream was put aside. These men were informed to immediately fall back to Fort Niagara and relieve the garrison. Native messengers reached the Ohio River Valley, but were also intercepted by Johnson's forces before Pouchot got word of their approach. 150 British men were sent to La Belle Famille to fortify the road outside of Niagara on July 23rd. On the morning of July 24th, a scouting party sent to bring up artillery was ambushed and butchered in the woods. Iroquois representatives were sent to the French lines to confer with the peoples of the Pays d'Oms. The Seneca cleverly asked for reciprocation of the neutrality they displayed earlier in the siege. French native allies agreed to withdraw from the upcoming battle and left the advancing French column. The parley had given Johnson time to bring up reinforcements from the siege lines outside of Niagara. The British were still spread out on the peninsula and rushed to consolidate their forces along the road. Almost 500 British were waiting for 800 French marching up the road towards the fort in a column. The British had cut a V-shaped trench at the spot where the dense woods opened up and with the point facing the French. This was covered by dense fresh foliage. Taken by surprise and suddenly faced with the desertion of their native allies, the Coureur de Bois and the Troupe de la Marine faced the full force of the British ambush alone. Unable to form up as they bottlenecked where the road opened into the cleared ground, French casualties mounted as piecemeal detachments were mowed down as they exited the forest onto the fortifications. Within a half an hour, the French relief force was shattered and retreated back down the road to their canoes. The Iroquois realized they wouldn't have to fight their Seneca brethren or Western trading partners, so they outflanked the French by this time and fell upon them in a frenzy. There is no historical proof Johnson himself was personally at the ambush site. He was most likely directing the siege operations in front of Niagara's walls. This is just as well because the French garrison made a sortie attempt to link up with the relief forces. Johnson had wisely detached only a minimal amount of men as the French sortie was quickly defeated. On July 25th, the garrison could no longer hold out. The post was surrendered to Johnson and the French were made prisoners of war. French forces feared a reverse William Henry massacre and were formed up in a square for more than 30 hours until a storm abated that allowed their passage into captivity. The prisoners were sent to New York City and reached it on August 20th, an arduous journey across western New York and down the Hudson River. A strange story emerged once the prisoners arrived safely in New York. An Englishwoman was amongst the camp followers of the French, and she had been captured at the Battle of the Wilderness in 1755 after accompanying her British husband. Believing that he was dead in Braddock's disastrous defeat, she married a French officer. Her first husband was indeed alive and demanded her back. She had a child with the French officer, but still made a decision to reunite with her British husband. The French officer received the right to their child, though. The British woman wasn't the only hostage found at the fort. People from as far as Nova Scotia had been captured and held. Assimilated British subjects from King George's War were even found as well. On August 16th, Johnson handed over his command to General Thomas Gage, who thought he could push up the St. Lawrence to Montreal, but that would have to wait for 1760. We can start to glimpse the mismatched expectations between the native and British people. This will develop later into Pontiac's rebellion at war's end. Iroquois prominence at such a crucial junction will engender the jealousy of the Western and Ohio River Valley tribes. British promises will be neglected to these tribes with the drawdown of forces at war's end, and the intermarried Coureur de Bois would be left without clear trade access. The tribes of the Pays d'Oms expected their new British neighbors to provide the requisite diplomatic trade goods and allow their syncretic Métis families to sell their furs to the European market. The victory at Niagara sealed British control of the Great Lakes, but would open up a Pandora's box of resistance that would engulf this region until 1815. On the other hand, this Western theater would soon be overshadowed by events in the East, where monumental struggles were taking place. Within the shadows of a fortress perched high upon a cliff, a mighty fleet laid anchor, with the fate of two empires hanging in the balance.